Namaste and good evening. I, Chavi Jain, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a special talk on asymmetric crime dynamics and social interactions. This discussion is a part of the series #Gender Gaps, organized by IMPRI, Gender Impact Studies Center. It is my privilege to introduce the chair for the session, Professor Govind Kelkar. Ma'am is the Executive Director at GenDev Center for Research and Innovation, Gurugram. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Ruben. Dr. Rubén obtained his PhD in economics at University College London and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Economics at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Sir is affiliated to the Erasmus Center for Economic and Financial Governance and is also a candidate fellow at the Tinbergen Institute. He works on topics such as intersection of political economy, development economics, and law and economics, and uses a theoretical and empirical approach to study questions on unethical behavior, corruption, abuse of power, discrimination, crime, and also elections. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Our discussants for today are Dr. Anand Shrivastava, who is a professor at School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, Bengaluru, and Dr. Renuka Sane, who is an assistant professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, Delhi. Thank you for joining us, sir and ma'am. Now, I invite our chair, Professor Govind Kelkar, to give her introductory remarks and proceed with the deliberation. We look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you very much for this very generous and very adequate introduction of the speaker. And we look forward to today's discussion. Very, very warm welcome to Dr. Ruben Poblete and Sajanova or Neva. Objective of today's discussion is the nexus between social interaction and reduction in crimes. And that is one of the things that I rapidly read your work, but I'm not so sure if I'm misrepresenting you, but we will hear you. So that would be the kind of this thing. This is very important to understand the human beings and human interaction, particularly in the when that person is withdrawn from the social sphere, because otherwise we are called social beings, women or men. But strangely, this study is very important because it takes kind of a pandemic situation and it talks about that when people are withdrawn to stay home, then how they behave. And whether they behave in terms of why there is a reduction in crime at that time. Our data in gender studies may be different, but the study by itself is very, very important. And what really we found out during the coronavirus period or during the lockdown, India has the largest lockdown, as you yourself presented, kind of, and very strict one for in the initial years. And that we have a lot of crimes. Who were these people who were criminals in that sense? And who were the perpetrators of these crimes and who were the people who were affected? We will come to that later. But one thing is clear, that probably in public violence, we have not done so much. So your theory with regard to if it is public violence and public kind of crimes, it may be very, very correct. So we really look forward to hearing you with a lot of attention, Dr. Ruben, and very pleased, very, very pleased and very, very warm welcome in this cold Delhi, but not so cold. But anyway, it's online, so we can be pleased to. You will make us really warm at heart and warm in mind. Look forward to. So over to you, Dr. Ruben.
Well, thank you very much all for the invitation and for the kind words for the presentation and the discussions again for being here. Had the availability to discuss this project. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see the presentation? Yeah. Okay, so the project that I'm gonna, thank you. The project that I'm gonna present today is about asymmetric crime dynamics and social interaction. So as you know, the social economic consequences of crime are quite significant for our society in terms of the amount of money that government spend in preventing crime, fighting crime, in terms of imprisonment, and also the amount of money that individuals spend for preventing crime and the social psychological consequences that cost can have on this. So because of this, it's very important to have a clear understanding of what are the main drivers of criminal behavior in order to be able to produce good policies to prevent crime. One of the important characteristics of many criminal crimes is that a lot of them depends on the physical interaction between a victim and a perpetrator. So in these cases, if a criminal cannot find a victim, some sort of crime simply cannot be committed, okay? So despite this fact, there have been little attention on certain type of policies that might alter social interaction opportunities as a crime preventing tool. So what I'm gonna do in this project and show you in this presentation is that I'm gonna study the role of social interactions on crime by using the natural experiment of lockdowns. And one important thing to take into account, as most of you know already, is that lockdown affected several different variables. And most of these variables, a lot of these variables can impact criminal activity in different ways. So one of the main important contributions of this paper is to try to disentangle among these very different mechanisms to explain what are the main important factors that affect crime. And a second important point is studying the dynamic effect of lockdown on crime. Not many papers have been analyzing what are the long-term consequences of the lockdown. And here I'm gonna put some evidence in terms of the crime. And mostly we're gonna have some new insights on what are the criminal motives and behavior. The setting of the study is India, and as Professor Govind already highlighted, would suffer the biggest lockdown in the world at some point. And we're gonna use the case of Bihar, which has a sudden announcement with immediate effect of the lockdown. Just to highlight you what are the main findings, so you can have a clear point where we are going. First, one of the main findings is that lockdowns actually reduce criminal activity. And the main driver of this crime drop seems to be driven by the low chances of a criminal victim encounter, okay? In terms of how crime evolved, we observe different crime patterns depending on the characteristics of the crime. So evidence suggests that there's temporal displacement for property crimes, but there's no temporal displacement for personal crimes. In this sense, the lockdown presented little societal benefits on the reduction of property crimes, since most of them were just committed once the lockdowns restrictions were eased. On the other hand, personal crimes not committed won't be committed in the future. And that's something that is new, that we didn't know in the literature, and provides some insights on how criminals' intertemporal behavior occurred for different types of crimes. So let me give you an overview of the presentation. First, I'm gonna start discussing what are the conceptual framework of how lockdowns impact criminal activity, and briefly discussing the context of Bihar. And then the presentation is going to have two parts. One is going to be focused on capturing the immediate impact of lockdown on crime and discussing what are the main mechanisms underlying this change in crime. And the second is going to be about the evolution of crime during a larger amount of periods. And finally, I'm gonna finalize with some takeaways. So let's go for the conceptual framework. As I said before, lockdowns affect criminal behavior in different ways. There are several channels by which lockdown might affect this, and therefore the impact on crime is uncertain, given that some of these channels increase and some other decrease criminal activity. One of the important points is that the main goal of the lockdown, by definition, is to prevent social encounters. Okay, so this reduction in social encounters implies that there's less people on the streets. The fact that there's less people on the streets can have different impacts on crime. On the one hand, it makes much more difficult for criminals to find victims. So this basically, the lack of people in the streets increase criminals' search costs, which at the end reduce criminal activity. On the other hand, the lockdown might have a direct self-incapacitation effects on criminals, in the sense that they might comply with the lockdown and stay at home, or might be have some certain fears of the virus, so they're not going for the streets. Or even maybe a strategic behavior of criminals, in the sense that if they don't see people on the street, there's no point going out. Okay, so any of these reasons might imply that the lack of criminals in the street might reduce, by definition, the amount of crime committed. On the other hand, there's an opposite effect of the fact that we observe less people on the street, and is given by the fact that there are less witnesses. And the fact that there's less witnesses in the street, it will increase crime, conditional on a criminal finding a particular victim. Another important point that we have to take into account is that in most countries in the world, the lockdown, in order to be implemented, require police resources to do so. So these have a very important impact on police behavior. And there's might be two different channels by which affects crime. On one hand, there's a large diversion of resources that were from crime reduction to lockdown enforcement. And there's several anecdotal accounts suggesting that at the very end, police were overburdened during the lockdown, which affect directly the capacity for them to fight criminal activity. I'm going to present evidence along this line later on. However, there's another effect through which police might impact crime. Lockdowns, okay, require police officers to be on the streets. So there's high police deployment, particularly in certain previously crowded areas. So this might deter criminals to commit certain type of crimes, particularly crimes that occurred in public places. Okay. And finally, there are two other points that we want to take into account. One is the fact that lockdowns might have an important effect on labor market condition. Most of this effect is not necessarily immediate, as you were seeing as the longer progress, labor market conditions were worse off, not only in India, but in most countries occur that. And this might drive several individuals to engage in criminal activity, particularly property crimes, okay? And finally, even if we observe a decrease in crime, this might not be because of true crime reduction. This might be because we observe a less amount of crimes that are reported. So lockdown could have affected the underreporting of several types of cases. I'm going to explain more some of this in a few minutes. Okay, so regarding the lockdown, what we observed is that we're going to analyze the case of Bihar. So as I said before, the chief minister of Bihar make a sudden announcement, which was with immediate effect of the lockdown during the 22nd of March in 2020 last year. And as at the beginning, as you all know, there were very strict restrictions, not only in Bihar, among the whole country in terms of what people can do or not. As the lockdown progressed, there were implemented different phases where different restrictions were applied in different districts across the country. One important thing that we want to highlight is the fact that a lot of the police in India, police enforcement agencies in India, were quite overburdened during the enforcement of the lockdown. And this is particularly the case for Bihar, which has one of the lowest police officer rate to population ratio in India. So just to mention this, for Bihar, the number of police officers per 100,000 people is about 81, which is almost half the amount of police officers in that branch of the country. Additionally, police officers were working a lot of hours, and this amount of hours increased substantially during the period of the lockdown. So nearly 80% of the police officers were working more than 11 hours, and even 30% of the police officers were working more than 15 hours a day. So this might have a very important impacts on police performance. So in order to analyze this, I'm gonna also, I gathered information about arrests for nearly 200 police stations in order to analyze how the lockdown impacted police performance. In terms of criminal activity, I gathered information coming from the first information reports for over 850 police stations in Bihar. So we have information about the registration and the incident dates, and particularly I classified criminal cases using the Indian penal codes. And this, the analysis across different criminal cases would be very useful in order to disentangle what are the main mechanisms driving the main results. One final thing that I want to highlight in the case of Bihar, that the police have made a lot of efforts in the last few years to make the reporting easy and more accessible to the people. And here in Bihar, the reporting can also be done online. So this at some point reduce the problem of underreporting, at least for people who have access to computers or cell phones with internet. Okay, so let me start showing a little bit of data. So in this graph, we have the mobility and also the number of crimes. So these black dots that you observe are the daily average crimes per 100,000 people at the police station level. And this solid line that you observe is the Google Mobility Index, which, as you can see, at the moment of the imposition of the lockdown, there's a large decrease in the mobility index. So people were basically, most of them were staying at home. And as the lockdown progressed and the different restrictions were imposed, the people were coming up to the streets, so they were less compliant with the lockdown. And as you can see, that actually there's a high correlation between the number of crimes committed per day and the amount of people that were going around the streets. As you can see, right, there's a large decrease in crimes and the aggregate crimes at the moment of the imposition of the lockdown. However, this might be driven by other characteristics that are changing at the same time, right? So in order to identify the impact of the lockdowns on criminal activity, I'm gonna use a regression discontinuity in design, basically using the time as a continuous variable. So the crucial point is the idea is to compare crimes that were committed, the number of crimes that were committed just before the lockdown versus the number of crimes that were committed just after the lockdown. And the crucial part is that we have to take into account other variables that are affecting crimes and might be changing in time. So in order to take into account that, I'm gonna control for other characteristics that affect crime and have been suggested by the literature, such as include day of the week's fixed effects, given that crimes during the weekends are much higher than during the weekdays, and also control for the amount of rainfall and temperature that also the literature suggests that affect criminal activity. So let me go directly to the first result. So here we have the immediate impact of lockdowns on criminal activity. So as you can see, the first column is the result for the aggregate crimes. So at the moment of the imposition of the lockdown, we observed a large decrease in the aggregate crimes. And this is about a 60% reduction due to the imposition of the lockdown. We observed also large effects across all the board for different types of criminal cases. For instance, in the case of property crimes, such as thefts, burglaries, and robberies, there's also a large decrease of them, ranging between a 40% decrease to 61% decrease. Similarly, for personal crimes, such as murder, kidnapping, and violence against women, there's large drops in criminal activity. One thing that I want to mention, given the context of this presentation, is puts a little bit of focus on the crimes against women. So a lot of the literature analyzing the impacts of lockdowns on crimes against women has been focusing on domestic violence, right? And most of the evidence for several countries have suggested there's been an increase in domestic violence during the period of the lockdown. However, there's also a positive consequences of the lockdown in terms of the, violence against women, particularly as we can show here for Bihar. Let me just be precise about this. So these crimes against women are mainly assaults that occur in public places, given that all this information are coming from the first information reports. And as you know, there are sensitive cases such as domestic violence cases that are not publicly reported, okay? So at least we can observe that the lockdown reduced severely the amount of crimes against women, basically assaults in the streets. Additionally, we observed a large decrease in the number of people protesting in the streets. And this has important consequences in terms of the reporting of the police. Most of these cases, well, the crimes against the rioting cases are reported by the police. So the accuracy of these cases in terms of the reporting are quite high. Okay, as you can see, lockdown reduced criminal activity, not only at the aggregate crime, but also across the board. So now the question is what is the main factor that drives this reduction in crime? And here the most likely reason is given by the low chances of a criminal victim encounter. Out of all the channels that I presented at the very beginning in the conceptual framework, the low chances of a criminal victim encounter can explain the decrease in crime for all these type of criminal cases, okay? Regardless the type of nature and the location where they are presented. So one thing that is important is that we observe a net negative effect of the lockdown on crime. So this allows us to first discard certain channels that increase criminal activity. It doesn't mean necessarily that these channels are not present there. It means that they are not the main reason why we observe this net decrease in crime. However, there's other potential explanations about this crime reduction. So here in this table, we have the different type of criminal cases and the reduction that was estimated, and how these arrows represent how the lockdown might impact this type of cases depending on the mechanisms that we're taking into account. And finally here, I put in whether the criminal cases are mostly occurred in public places or not. So the other potential options that might explain why we observed a decrease in crime can be due to a high police deployment in the street. Given the evidence that we already observed and something that I'm going to show in the next slide, I think this is unlikely to be the main reason for explaining all this large decrease in all these crimes. First of all, there's a large theoretical and empirical literature showing that police deployment has no effects of any type of crimes that occurred in private dwellings. So for instance, in the case of murders, most of the murders occurred in private homes, and police officers, the literature have never found that they have an impact in preventing crimes, let alone observing the murders when they occurred. Additionally, so this basically, the police deployment is not a good explanation to explaining the decrease in burglaries and murders. Additionally, the capacity of the police in fighting crime was severely reduced during the period of the lockdown. Using the data that I mentioned before in terms of arrests, the number of the share of the arrests at the moment of the imposition of the lockdown were decreased in about 80%, suggesting that the police didn't have like the capacity to fight criminal activity as it used to be before the lockdown. In terms of the reporting, it's unlikely that this also is the main reason for this decrease in crime, particularly certain type of criminal cases such as murder, for instance, or riots, as I mentioned before, are quite accurately reported. So this cannot explain the reason for this drop in criminal cases. And something additional that we can do is to analyze how complainants' behavior changes because of the lockdown. So what I do in that case, analyze the delays, how many days it took from the incident of the crime until the reporting of the crime. And if anything, what we observe is that the number of days that pass between the incident of the crime until the reporting of the crime decreased during the lockdown. And this might be driven by the fact that the lockdown reduced considerably the opportunity of time, in the sense that people were basically staying at home, so they didn't have not many other activities in what to use their time. So there's not much evidence to suggest that reporting might be the main reason to this large crime drop. Let me show you this additional evidence going in line with the main mechanisms. So if we analyze, for instance, that the police deployment might have an impact on criminal activity, then what we would observe is that in districts with a high police capacity, those districts that have high police capacity will be more effective in fighting crime as opposed to districts with lower police capacity. Having data about the police capacity at the police station level is quite hard. So what I do is I collect information about the number of judges at the district level and the number of police stations at the district level, which is highly correlated with the number of police officers, at least when we observe information at the state level. And what we observe is that when we separate a district that have high police capacity versus low police capacity, we do not observe any significant differences among these districts. And if anything, we observe a little bit larger effects on districts that have lower police strength. So this evidence go in line that police strength or police deployment might not be the main reason for this crime drop. In the case of the probability of a criminal victim matching, on the other hand, what we can look is what happened with the compliance. So the idea is the following. In districts where there's low compliance, meaning that there's like a lot of individuals going in the streets, we might observe a lower decrease in criminal activity as opposed to districts which have a high compliance. So in order to do this, what I use is as a measure of compliance the share of crimes against public health. One thing that we have to take into account is that the crimes against public health are basically cases where the police see many people in the street during the lockdown, and they shouldn't be in the street. Okay, so these people are charged against this public health. Okay, so one thing that is important to take into account is that yes, this measure might be correlated with the police strength. However, I do not find any evidence that the police strength is correlated at all with the compliance with the lockdown. Okay, so this is a measure better for the compliance with the lockdown, and it's not correlated necessarily with the police strength. And what you can see when you separate district with high compliance versus low compliance, evidence is going in the direction that places that have low compliance, meaning more people on the street, have a lower reduction in crime compared to places with high compliance. Okay, so this might suggest that the probability of a victim, criminal victim encounter, might be the main driver of the crime drop. Finally, I want to highlight, I want to mention some stuff about the crime dynamics. First, lockdown, as you know, affect the cause of crime across time and location. So it's important to understand whether criminals postpone these crimes, what the lockdown restriction is or not. The only part that I want to highlight is this graph. I don't want to crowd you out with a lot of information. So let me just explain this following figure. So here we have the estimates of the impact on criminal activity for different, as the lockdown progress, okay? So as you can see, for instance, here we separate for crimes, for property crimes and personal crimes. And what you observe at the beginning is the initial impact of the lockdown on criminal activity. This is consistent with the evidence that I showed before, right? There's a large reduction in both of these crimes. However, as the lockdown progressed, the impact of the lockdown on this type of crimes were reduced and almost disappeared by week 5 or week 7, depending on the type of crime. Particularly in terms of the personal crimes, as you can see in these orange dots, what we can see is that all these crimes, all these personal crimes, return to the pre-lockdown level after 7 weeks, and they stay at the pre-lockdown level, which means basically that the lockdown prevented a certain amount of kidnapping, a certain amount of murders, and these murders were not compensated once the lockdown restrictions were eased. On the other hand, property crimes, what we observed that they return to pre-lockdown level more or less at the same time. However, they go over and above the pre-lockdown level. So this can mean two things. One is there's temporal displacement, meaning that all the criminal cases that were not committed in the first few weeks, they're postponed afterwards when the restrictions were eased, or they're more the bad labor market outcomes, right? Push new individuals to engage in criminal activity. Okay. Basically, I don't have time to show you the results, but when you compare districts that were severely affected by labor market outcomes, such as the amount of unemployment or the amount of migrants that were arriving to the district and they didn't have any job, you observe similar evolution of property crimes among these two type of districts, suggesting that the amount of new criminals are not the main reasons for this jump after 7 or 8 weeks. So potentially the biggest reason for this increase or overshooting in property crimes are due to temporal displacement. Okay, so let me just go with the main takeaways. So first of all, this paper shows that the lockdowns decrease criminal activity, okay? But more importantly, what is the reason to observe this large crime drop? What can we learn from this and what can we use for future public policies? So this large reduction in crime was due to a lower chances of a criminal victim encounter. So different type of policies that might go in this direction might be quite effective in reducing crime. Think about, for instance, the case of curfews that are imposed during the night. However, importantly is to take into account what are the true effects of these policies on certain type of criminal cases. Particularly, what we observe is that these type of policies are effective in preventing personal crimes, as these were not displaced afterward. So basically, this reducing the chances of a criminal victim encounter reduce a certain amount of murders now, and they are not compensated afterwards. Meaning basically that if I don't murder somebody today, it's not that I'm going to murder 2 people tomorrow. Okay, this doesn't happen for this type of personal crime. On the other hand, for property crimes, what we observe that these type of policies deter criminal activity for property crimes only temporary, but at the very end, there's an increase in property crimes afterwards. So let me finish with that, so I don't crowd out all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruben. It was really very well kind of cohesive presentation in terms of both data and your analysis. So we'll come back to you. I would request the 2 discussants to give their opinion on the piece and whatever they want to say. So Dr. Anand Shrivastava, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Govind. Thank you, Ruben, for that excellent presentation. I'll quickly share a very few slides about the response. So, I mean, it's a really nice, very interesting work, asking a very interesting question. The identification technique of the lockdown is really interesting, and I think potentially there are other questions also that can be answered using this particular identification. And of course, the data set of FIRs is really unique, and again, many potential other questions can be asked. I think it's very interesting line of research. And the results are intuitive. I think it definitely makes sense what you find, and they're quite substantive in terms of the size. So I really like the paper. I have a few comments and suggestions, and two main points. The first part is about, as you may expect, is about the underreporting. So the key assumption is that so basically what we're observing are FIRs, right? And the key assumption is that the probability that an FIR is filed conditional on a crime having been committed is not changing with the treatment, it's not changing with the lockdown. We know that this probability is definitely less than 1, and that it will be different for different kinds of crime. And so this becomes, as you've correctly pointed out, more of a concern, not for things like rioting and murders where it's likely to be reported, but for things like crimes against women and property crimes, where this reporting rate may be subject to change. Right, and the online reporting is nice, but I think it doesn't really, in this case, have much of an impact. Bihar has a really low internet penetration rate, so unless we see that most of this thing is online, we don't really work. I mean, the one thing that I think you can do to substantiate, I mean, the overall argument makes sense that this cannot explain everything that you're finding. But if the result also is about each of the individual things, then there is a concern that this could be explaining a lot of the impact in these particular kinds of crimes, the crimes against women and property crimes. So the delay thing is very interesting, what you find that the delay goes down. And I was just thinking whether there was a way to use that. So this is just off the top of my head, but maybe you can explore. If we assume that, the relationship between delay and the probability of reporting the crime remains same. So if I report it immediately, I'm more likely to report it, and if I'm waiting for 10 days, it's less likely that the crime will be reported. Then during the lockdown, maybe the people who are going to report it quickly go on and report it, and people who would have otherwise taken a time are the people who maybe live very far away from the police station, are poorer, and those are the people who are not reporting. So if you assume that this relationship does not change, that people who are able to report it quicker are more likely to report, people who report after a long time are less likely to report. Maybe the new distribution of delay that you find post-lockdown can be used to estimate underreporting and correct your estimates for that. I still believe that you will find an effect, but you can do some sort of a correction. The second point, main point I had was the temporal displacement. Again, I believe that I think it makes sense that happens, but can we completely discount the possibility of new crimes being committed because of the impact of lockdown? I think the low and high unemployment story is not very convincing, because I don't think in the Indian context unemployment is a driver of crime. Like, unemployment is actually being driven by people who can afford to not stay employed, right? These are people who are actively looking for work. So you could think of if there was some way, if some variable that is a driver of crime. So I don't know, maybe youth. I have not seen this literature, but maybe youth unemployment is more of a driver of a crime, or income inequalities is more of a driver of crime. If you can use some of these variables, I think the case will be much stronger. And there's a number of minor points. I don't want to spend too much time on it. The only one point that I'll send this to Ruben, of course, is this: you don't have the police personnel per capita, and you're using number of judges. I know you find it in another data set that is quite correlated, but to me it seems that it could be, then that could be reflecting many things, administrative capacity, so many other things. It may not be about police personnel. But I mean, I don't have a good suggestion on what else you can do there, but I'm just highlighting that some of these things you may need to find other ways to reinforce if they're a kind of main part of your story. So those were all the suggestions I had. I think it was a great presentation. I look forward to how it develops in the future. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Shrivastava. One would agree with a lot of your suggestions. And I think Dr. Ruben also would take them positively in order to further improve. That is the whole purpose of being a discussant is there. So Dr. Sahini, Dr. Sinha, or no, Dr. Renuka Sane. Where are
Hello.
you?
Yeah, I'm Renuka Sane.
Sorry, Dr. Renuka. You noted your name and then I was looking where I noted.
No problem at all.
Please pardon me. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for asking me to look and think about this paper. I agree with a lot of what Anand has said, and sometimes the problem with going second is that it appears as if you're copying the guy who went first. But so I'm going to repeat some of what Anand said, but these are the points that I had noted.
Not really. We won't think of that.
I agree that this is a very interesting paper and a very interesting question, and that I'm quite curious how you got the FIR data set and how you actually managed to put it together. So it would be nice in the paper also to get a description of how you collected the data set and whether it was given to you on a platter or did you have to hand collect it and do something to actually put it together. And a little bit more detail on the sanctity of the data, because this data is notoriously difficult to get, and so I'm very curious about how you managed to pull that off. So that's one comment on how you could improve the writing in the paper and the information that you are giving in. The second point, and I'm just going to kind of narrate the points as I noted them down. One interesting summary statistic, if you have one, would be the difference between the FIRs that come online versus offline. So are you able to distinguish between those that were reported online versus offline, both prior to the lockdown and post the lockdown? So that again will answer some of the questions that Anand has raised in terms of, who is it that's reporting, and are more reports coming online, right? Has the mechanism changed? And related to that is the point on the delay, which is, has the time between when the event occurs and when the reporting occurs changed? So, is it that people are waiting and then reporting the crime, and then can you make something? So if there is a delay in the reporting of the crime, then the time when you note that the crime happened is actually different. So how do you, and maybe you already do that in your analysis, so it will be useful to clarify that as well, saying how do you differentiate between, has there been a delay in the reporting of the crime, and can one make something out of that? From one of the graphs that you showed, it seems to me that there is a threshold level of crime. And so mobility goes higher and higher, but the crime kind of stays. It was one of the earliest graphs that you presented. And again, that was very interesting to me because it shows that there is some threshold level of crime in that economy or society. And once you get back to normal, you end up at that threshold again. So all that the lockdown has done is that it has kept people home for some time, and so neither can the victims go out, but nor can the criminals go out, and hence you see this reduction, and then it comes back to normal. So maybe all that is happening here is that people can't step out of their houses, and hence there is no crime, and then crime comes back. But then I'm not sure what policy implication I should draw from this, because not stepping out is hardly a solution to anything, correct? So, one of the things that you say is that you want to reduce the criminal victim encounters, so to speak. But is that really feasible? Is that something that we can really think of in terms of, is that even a mechanism to reduce crime in the true sense of the term? So I find myself a little nervous at what inference to draw from this finding. And so I'd sort of leave it there and ask for your thoughts on this, and maybe the thoughts of other panelists as well. And another point that I thought which was interesting was that we see that there is an increase in property crimes, and that increase in property crimes also happens later. So you're kind of overcompensating for the property crimes that didn't happen during the lockdown. The correct counterfactual really is that if you had a lockdown where there was no shock, there was no economic shock, there was no income loss, would then property crimes have been overcompensated? Because here I think that you're muddled a little bit, as in the data is muddled, because there is an economic shock going on. And I agree with Anand that, just looking at unemployment rates may not adequately be able to help you to disentangle why is it that property crimes are being overcompensated. Because maybe what's happening here is, if there was no income shock and you just had a lockdown, then property crimes would just come back to normal. Because earlier you could go and do some property crime. Now neither can you go out. And if you are able to go out, everybody else is staying at home, so you're likelier to get caught. Houses are not locked for the full day because all the neighbors are around, and then it's that much harder to commit some kind of a property crime. And once that condition goes away, you go back to normal. But now you have this economic shock also combined. And, is that the driver for an increase in property crimes? I think that perhaps you could use some nightlights data. Maybe that's some proxy for economic growth. Maybe a little bit more migration data that you could use, because where are these property crimes happening? Maybe those areas where there are more migrants, no property crimes happen because that area is poorer to begin with. So what kind of a property crime are you going to do when everybody around you is poor? And so can you kind of distinguish between some sort of an income differential between these regions to figure out where is it that property crimes have increased? So not just in terms of high applicability of the lockdown versus low intensity of the lockdown, but also in terms of the economic activity in those regions. So maybe property crimes are happening in those regions where there is more economic activity because there is more to steal from in some ways. So I think a little bit more digging into the whole property crime aspect and how you could disentangle income shocks versus just the lockdown effect driving these crimes. I think that would be interesting. And one final comment is, and I know you mentioned this in your presentation, which is that crime against women drops. And that really is surprising to me, because we know that a lot of crimes against women are committed by people that she knows. So even if it's not the family, it's somebody in your circle that is generally the perpetrator of the crime. And so why that should drop is a bit of a puzzle to me, and I'm surprised by that result, to be honest. So I'll just leave it at that, and I wish you the very best for this paper.
Thank you, Dr. Renuka Sane. What about we go now to Dr. Arjun or Simi? What do you think, that we take the questions from the audience, or what do we do?
Ma'am, we can go to Dr. Ruben to respond to
the discussant remarks, or to the audience and including. Because there is one or two questions from the I can see in chat box. I would suggest that we take that also and then request Dr. Ruben to respond. Is that okay? Dr. Ruben, is that okay? So there is one kind of in the chat box, there is one kind of concern that during lockdown children suffers a lot. And the other request, of course, so their mental and physical violence against the small children also is very important. So there has been this kind of inclusion. Besides Dr. Renuka Sane said about the women's kind of thing, and I will also say something in my concluding note. But probably before that, we want to request you to address these kind of what discussant have said and what this particular question has come with regard to crimes against children. Over to you, Dr.
Okay, thank you very much for all the very insightful comments. It has been very productive already to be here in part of the discussion. I think all of the points are quite interesting and very, very good. So address the other points. So let me start going backwards. Regarding the crimes against children, I agree with that. Something that actually surprised me a lot is that there's not much evidence looking for how lockdown impacted abuse against children. Most of the domestic violence paper are focused on violence against women. I was looking into that at some point. Unfortunately, the data from the FIR have very few cases related with the abuse against children. There's some acts particularly going in that direction, but the cases are very, very few. So basically you cannot do anything about it. The other option would be to use data coming from some NGO. However, if underreporting is an issue for violence against women, is a bigger issue for violence against children. So I think it's very, very hard to have a very clear impact of the lockdown on that, unfortunately. For sure, there should be something more to do in that direction, but it's very hard. Since I just mentioned the FIR data, so in the case of Bihar, this data is available in the online, okay, and can be scraped. For some other state, this is also possible, but it's much harder to do so because there's some say prevention to do so in terms of captchas and so on. For the case of Bihar, it's not that hard to process that. Unfortunately, some part of the data, yes, so I cannot distinguish, that's a good point, but I cannot distinguish which are made online, were made online or in the police station. Maybe I can do that for Delhi, but not for Bihar. And for Delhi, I don't have the whole data. But that's something that, yeah, it's something to think about it. My perception is that most of these databases, so most of the reported crime are coming from people directly going to the police station. As also Anand mentioned, the Bihar is a very poor state, right? Like, unfortunately, not many people have a lot of access to internet and so on. Can I just share briefly the one graph that I couldn't show, which is related to, where's that? Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
So this is the graph related to the delays in reporting. And yeah, so this is basically, as you can see, like at the first line, right, is the moment of the imposition of the lockdown, and the number of delays once the imposition of the lockdown started decreased. My perception about this is that most of the people were staying at home, so they didn't have any other activity that can be more, they didn't have much to do, right? So the opportunity of time was severely decreased during the lockdown. Something that would be interesting, and I haven't done it, is to see how this varies across different type of crime. My perception, or at least what I would expect to see, is that for severe crimes such as murder, there shouldn't be any change, right? If you observe, right, this event, probably most of the people will go directly and report to the police right away instead of just waiting. So probably like the changes in delay and reporting were higher in some crimes such as thefts, for instance. Yeah, in terms of what date I use for the paper, I use the date of the day of the incident. Okay, not the day of the reporting, because the reporting, as you were saying, there might be some delay. So all the analysis was based on the incident date. Regarding the optimal level crime, yes, I agree with that. Every society have unfortunately has a positive level of crime. And yes, most of the, as you were seeing, like they were like returning to the optimal level. If I would guess, if perhaps we have a longer time span, property crimes will, after the overshooting, will go back again to the steady state crime level. What else I have? In terms of the policy implications, yes, that's a good point. So in terms of the policy implications, I think that's why it's important to try to understand what is the main mechanism, right? The mechanism that can explain this life reduction is the probability of a criminal victim encounter, right? Defined in a broad way, right? In this particular setting would be basically that there's kind of be a physical interaction between criminals and perpetrators, right? Mostly driven by not many victims, potential victims in the street, rather than many criminals going in the street, okay? If it were for criminal, it's very easy. It's related more to incapacitation in terms of imprisonment. However, a policy cannot be let's everybody stay at home, right? That's not possible. It is possible only in the case of curfews. And I think at least in that regard, if you're observing a large surge of criminal cases, a curfew would be a very useful way to prevent and stop all this criminal activity. So I think that would be a policy implication in that sense. However, I think like other type of policies that can go in line to decrease in some way the probability that a potential victim can be in the same place with a potential perpetrator could go in the same direction. What are the best optimal ways to do so is hard to tell. I think would be very useful to have a clear understanding of what are the most likely victims for certain type of criminal cases. So surveys about victimization might provide us about what are the most important characteristics to recognize what are the most likely victims. And in there, for those people, right, potentially create certain type of policies that might reduce the chances that they are super exposed to perpetrators. However, I think the other part in terms of the dynamics of crime, I think this provides us some new insight that we didn't have in the literature. There was nothing related about how criminals behave intertemporally speaking. Okay, particularly most of the analysis is static. What we find is that preventing personal crimes, murder, kidnapping, this kind of crimes, now there won't be overcompensated in the future. Okay, and that's something that we didn't know before. And this is very interesting in terms of how criminals behave and what are the motives for this type of crimes. So most of these kind of crimes are crimes of passion, right? Which are basically committed in the heat of the moment, and particularly with people that you know, okay? So if there's any way of preventing those crimes, right, there's a positive effect on our society. And that's something that we don't observe for property crimes. Now, as both of you suggest, it's very, very hard to be able to disentangle mechanisms in the long term, right? Because particularly a lot of things were changing, right, during as the lockdown progressed. With the part of I don't think we can rule out completely the fact that a lot of this overshooting is driven by new criminals engaging in crime. I don't think we can do that. What I try to do is to compare districts in terms of unemployment rates, as I said before, and in terms of the amount of migrants that came along in the districts. In terms of the unemployment, yes, something that happened in Bihar, I was using the data from CMIAE, and then the unemployment severely increased in Bihar during the period of the lockdown, more than 40% within a month. Yes, I have to think about like whether there's other ways to disentangle new criminals. I was thinking, I don't know if you have any other suggestion about the ones that you mentioned. It's really hard to geolocate the type of crime. So I think it would be hard to go in that margin, but something that would be another option maybe would be analyzing who are the people who were arrested and see whether these are the same individuals that were arrested before or new type of individuals to see whether there are new people engaged in criminal activity. I haven't done that. Maybe that's a potential area to explore. I don't know whether it would be fruitful or not. Yes, in terms of the using the delays as a correction for the estimation, yeah, I haven't thought about that. That's a good point. I don't know exactly how to be able to do it, but I can take a look. In terms of data from youth employment, is there any data at the district level for that matter? If that's the case, that would be really good to analyze. So maybe if any of you have like some direction in that sense, I think that could be useful. And also income inequality, yeah, I can use that to several districts. Do I have anything else to cover? I don't recall. Yeah. But thank you for your comments. Honestly, are very useful.
And thank you, Dr. Ruben. You have covered most of the point. I also have some points, Dr. Ruben. I was thinking that how do you define crime? There can be crime and there can be offense if you take the legal term. And it would be important that you must draw your parameter. Every crime or every crime cannot be a crime, and every offense also cannot be a crime. So when you define that, either you take legal term or you take the social term in your analysis, analytical. That was, I was looking for that and I didn't find that. Second is also why the delays happened. I mean, there were some crimes, but why did the delay happen? It was because of the lockdown or because of the particular, you probably think that it was because of the lockdown, but we would like to know the definite reasons for that. Third is really, who were these people who were arrested? People were arrested, but more important, I'm looking for why they were arrested, and then really tells you the nature of the crime. So recording kind of police data can be very fuzzy. That would be the, and so murder is not the only crime. Close to kind of what would be the other kind of crimes that you were looking. And if you are looking for murders, then say that this is the definition of your murder and other things. And then there was also kind of some interaction was necessary with the called shadow reports, or the reports that are produced. They were also being produced. People were writing also during that time, NGO or afterwards. For example, what are the things that people were in a kind of half serious note, I can say the criminals were sitting at home and beating the women. And this is how the report has come. Why the violence globally increased against women during this period? There are two kinds of data that are, and they are available, that increased care work of women, tremendous increase, taking care of children, taking care of elderly, meeting the demands of the elderly parents, and the husbands kind of thing still wanted the hot food and clean house and all that goes with it, the whole package. And if it was not given, then women were first shouted and they were beating. That is the, now is beating a crime or not kind of thing. So they may not go to report to the police, but to say that crimes did not happen, one, I find it very difficult. And this crime, I think in countries like France, Europe also is increased. I don't have the data for Netherlands, but Netherlands also reported increase in crimes. You are based in Netherlands, I just thought kind of thing maybe. But in India, it is doubled. And these were the conservative estimates. And nobody questions this kind of data because women did not go for reports. But where do you go for reporting kind of thing? There was a question of hungry children and hungry people. And in Madhya Pradesh, I was asking with some NGO Pradhan, who were probably must have heard, that why, what, in your opinion, what was the reason that these kinds of so much beating up of the women happened? And they said three reasons. One was that not taking care of the elderly parents. So husband would get very angry that you are not taking good care of them. Children crying, second reason. That can't you manage children? Can't you keep kind of this thing? And then slapping was a minor thing and more kind of beating happened. And third was the kind of hot food. Hot food was not available. So in that kind of, maybe in that kind of boredom, you wanted hot food, but men did not really took care of themselves producing hot food. However, in some cities, there are reports men started sharing some work, helping, probably they called helping the women. So it is women's work, so you help. It is not the men's work that and women's work. Everybody's work that if you are eating, you should be cooking also. We know that. So now in this helping of the work, housework, what happened was there were all kinds of disparaging humor started. People were on social media, I read a paper in Economic and Politically, I was really surprised to see that. So this humor has twofold. One humor was between the maid, the house worker whom they hired, and between the maid. There would be the, house worker and the employee and employer, you can say that. So a housekeeper would, they say that employee, the house owner, she went to meet the maid. They use the word maid. I don't like to use that. Anyway, she went to meet the maid, and the maid was wearing good sari and putting lipstick and all this. This is the humor, that is kind of thing. And the house owner says that I came to see her and I was in poor kind of chappals or slippers, and I had torn sari and I had not done any makeup on me. My hands were kind of soiled hands, all this kind of description, this kind of disparaging. So one was this kind of humor. Other kind of humor was, oh, our man has become really feminine man. He's not doing anything. He's just going to do the kind of housework. So there was a joke, this kind of thing, that the man reports that I wanted to call my boss. And the boss called me, and woman answered and she said, he's cooking. So I'll tell him to call you later. Then boss, he didn't call. So boss said that, why didn't you call me? He said, I called you, but your wife said that you are washing the utensils. Look at this kind of the joke that kind of went around and looking down of this rise in masculinity, which leading to crime. So I think if your definition of the crime can be more nuanced, that will be really good. That would kind of give a lot of strength to your paper. So this was, I was thinking that this is still a puzzle, that why the kind of the numbers are coming, people are debating, and after that a lot of attention has been drawn to increase care work, and it should be recognized, and there are kind of attempts being made to assess it and recognize it. But the question is, during lockdown, it became very, very evident. So it was really not a kind, maybe your thesis applies in my mind, that social interaction is stopped outside in the public spaces, but it condensed at home. And then they began to indulge in crime. They began to beat children, they began to beat the women, because they were, so role of not only crime of passion, but crime of power will be also important, and expression and manifestation within home will be very important to look at this. At least you acknowledge the problem. I mean, we cannot really bypass the situation, because we can say that this problem was there, I did not find the data, I did not do this, every paper has limits. But if you don't say anything about it, then there is a problem. So thank you so much. But otherwise, it has been fantastic presentation, fantastic discussion, and I enjoyed and learned every bit of it. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thanks. Actually, can I just say something about the last one you mentioned? Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's quite important. And actually, I'm working in another project, specifically looking on the domestic violence and how this has been evolving in India in the last few years, and particularly what are the consequences of the lockdown in the long term. One of the biggest problems about that is that once you start, say, when these events occur, it's more likely that this occurs in the future. So that's a very important concern. And yes, the only problem with that is like measuring this is quite hard. So for instance, for this other project, we're looking at data from the National Commission of Women to see how this has been evolving. Maybe I can just share the screen just for 1 second. So here there is data coming from that source and separating the type of different type of offenses like indecent, molestation, and so on. Something that is quite interesting is that at the very beginning there is a decrease at the beginning of the imposition of the lockdown. By the way, this is data for all India, not for the hand, right? So at least at the national level, the lockdown started by 25th of March. So for some states before this, but there's a reduction in domestic violence close to the period of the lockdown. However, this has been increasing afterwards. I don't have the data yet to see what happened in the long term, but that's something that we want to explore, as you mentioned.
Very, very interesting, very important. Yeah. Arjun or Simi, please. Dr. Arjun.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. We have Sahiba Imran also. She has raised a hand. If we could have her on the screen.
Sure, I did not see that. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, ma'am.
Oh.
Yes. Sahiba, talking is permitted. If you could just present your question. Yes, I.
Thank you for allowing, ma'am. It's not a question as such, but since I'm working on a PhD topic related to women prisoners, I come across many legal terms, and very rightly, ma'am pointed out, definition of crime is very gender biased. So when the base is itself not, in a secular form, in a rational form, obviously the building on which we have make it, that is also lacking that nuances in it. And there are, legally man, woman are same, but socially they are not. But while taking into account the criminal behavior of an individual, it is very different for a man and it is very different for a woman. And I'm more working in my project, I'm working more on the impact on women imprisonment and its impact on their dependent children. And it is very, disturbing to share that when a man is inside the prison, yes, there is an impact on the family in a very negative term. But when a mother is not there at home, you won't believe how pathetic condition a child is going on. That is one thing. And another thing, man criminalization or imprisonment has a stigma, but not as woman has. So this submission I want to make on the basis of the thing I have read till now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saira. Imran, very important.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So actually something that you mentioned, what I'm, at least for my paper, what I'm using is just like the legal definition. In terms of what I'm using is basically the Indian penal codes to classify all the crimes. Yes, there might be some biases, right, in how the law is written. I cannot do anything about that to correct that. In terms, for instance, for violence against women, I'm looking for, let me say, well, I don't have like all the Indian penal codes. For instance, the most common one, as I said before, is assault of criminal force to women with intent to outrage her modesty. That covers, at least from the data from the police, about 70%. But there's also other acts that are related in that category. I don't have the data at the moment to really tell you which ones were related, but basically everything that is related with female or certain acts against marriage, those are included in this. But yes, basically one of the biggest problems, particularly with this type of data regarding crime against women, is the underreporting, for sure.
Simi?
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Ruben, for your response. So, Professor Govind, can we start with the way forward round? We could begin with the discussants. That's fine.
Yes, sure. So this time, Dr. Renuka Sane. So the doctor can we say that what would be the way forward? I will start with the discussant first and then come to Dr. Ruben. What should be the way forward?
I wish Ruben the best of luck in sort of improving the paper that he has already presented. I think you've got some interesting set of comments from all the people present here today. So in terms of the paper, I think there is some direction on where to go. In terms of the larger context of crime and crimes against women and how to measure what drives crime, I think in India, we are only at the start of more quantitative literature on these questions, partly because I'm delighted to hear that a lot of this data is available online and we could scrape it. I didn't know. And perhaps more research can be done trying to find many correlates of crime with other things. I kind of want to emphasize the quant research aspect of it, because I know that many people who work on the ground actually do have an idea of what is going on. But economists and quantitative social scientists have probably not translated that into a very deep research literature in India. So I think this probably is the starting point, or it encourages us to do a little bit more in trying to understand the dynamics of crime and what drives it and how we can reduce it, what effects it has on people. So many questions in this space for all of us to pursue. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anand Shrivastava.
Thanks. And now going second, I'm going to repeat everything that Renuka said. But yeah, Ruben, fantastic work. I think this paper, I think it will turn out well. But I was also delighted to see that you're also working on the domestic violence work, and I think it will be very important to see, taking both of these things together, how lockdown impacted the entire kind of situation of crime in the country, but specifically against women. And I think this is part of, as Renuka said, an increasing amount of quantitative work in this area. And I think a lot more needs to be done. I know that each paper has to have a policy kind of part. So you have made that, but I think the actual any kind of policy thing will come from a body of work, which will actually require a lot of papers and many more people working on this, and give us a comprehensive understanding of what exactly is going on, and some kind of concrete policy recommendations will come out of it. So I wish you all the best in this work. Thank you.
Any other suggestion from anyone? Otherwise, I don't want to have a last word, but I have to say something.
We could have Dr. Ruben, his views.
Dr. Ruben, let me tell you also, not as a chair, but as a kind of participant. I think you are in a very good kind of frame of point because you have already seems collecting data, available data on violence against women, and you have the framework. So this paper has a great potential in my mind after today's discussion to develop into a good paper in terms of women inclusive kind of thing. So that we don't want you to drop the other data or other analysis, but you can do that data plus you include this also. That would be that to the extent possible. Thank you. Now, please, up to you. Over to you.
I want to just thank everybody for the very insightful comments. I really appreciate this. Yes, for instance, like the idea in the larger agenda would be to try to gather as much possible data in this kind of domestic violence, not only including women, but also analyzing children, if possible. We have been having difficulties in that direction. But the idea would be to study these cases for a longer period of span, at least 15 years, and see how these have evolved across different states, districts, and particularly how the impact of lockdown affected. Like it has been already almost 2 years since the beginning, and we don't know how families are coping nowadays, whether the people that suffer, women that suffer basically domestic violence, are still recurring with these events or not. So I think this is a project on its own, and hopefully we're gonna get some policy implications to improve the lives of these people.
Simi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ruben, for those concluding thoughts. And certainly, this entire deliberation has been very important and very passionate responses from all of you, including Dr. Ruben, Dr. Renuka, Dr. Anand, and Professor Govind. Thank you very much for presenting your views, and absolutely the points that have been raised is are very significant. I would like to invite Govind ma'am. Ma'am, would you like to present your concluding remarks, if you have any? Govind ma'am.
I have already said
Okay.
what is in my analysis was there, that we really enjoyed your framework. I have not had many kind of discussions with this kind of thing. And your theory, I do believe in the theoretical analysis kind of thing, that how the social interaction kind of behaves kind of thing. That and this is a puzzle to me, as I said, that we are a social being, and every day I read about this thing, that people who are interacting only through laptop and other things, and that is not as creative and as thought-provoking as the personal interaction would be. There are kind of technologists who are saying this, and there are other social scientists also who are saying this. So, but in the same social kind of network, then you see that people also behave kind of in a being attacking each other, various kind of crimes. That would be important too. So within home, when they concentrated or they created that kind of social interaction at home, then they began to be violent, more violent than they were earlier, that kind of thing. So this crimes of power and passion, of course, crime is related to kind of not a different kind of power expression, is also a major feature in the kind of being introducing criminality in mind. That would is important, because he is the very powerful at home kind of thing, the person who comes home. So but women and children both suffer in terms of, for one reason or another. That is so that would be, and you are collecting data. So already, I mean, analysis would be important. The other thing is that we would like very much for you, as I said earlier, and which you agreed, that we want your parameters of what is crime. That we don't want really the police definition of the crime or the state definition of crime, but a researcher like you saying, what do you think is the crime during this kind of thing? Because it may be murder, rape is a crime, but to me, I mean, this kind of condition of women and children when they are doing something, this is also crime. We say what kind of crime. So just as a kind of researcher, we would, I would request you to do this kind of thing. Having said that, it is a kind of great paper and you have the great potential. So thank you. Look forward to your completed paper on this thing. And the discussant remarks have been very important in terms of giving the suggestions, both of Renuka Sane and also Anand Shrivastava. So that is also one of the would enrich your paper. And I personally gained a lot from your analysis. Thank you very much. Thank you, every member of the audience, and raising these questions. I wish there more questions were coming, but at this time, And with the onset of the winter, people are a bit in a hurry to go, to wind up. Not only, I can't say to go home because they may be sitting at home, but to wind up. Thank you. Simi, now you can continue.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Govind, ma'am, for your wonderful concluding thoughts. And so I would like to propose a formal vote of thanks on behalf of the IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center um, on the topic asymmetric crime dynamics and social interactions. Dr. Ruben, you have provided your wonderful insights, and we really thank you and wish you all the best for your paper as you complete, and also for your upcoming work on domestic violence. I would also like to thank our discussants for the session, Dr. Anand Shrivastava and Dr. Renuka Sane, and most of all, our Professor Govind Kelkar, the chair of the session. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful, for chairing this wonderful session and for presenting your thoughts as well. And also thank you to Sahiba and also to all the other attendees here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. Thank you to all those who would be watching us later on YouTube and listening to our podcasts. Thank you, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you so much. Thank you.